I thought we could do some Buddha Nusati this morning. This will be from the introduction of Buddhadhamma by Payutto, The Laws of Nature and Their Benefits to Life. So found I was starting to go through this. This is kind of one of the most important. Ajahn Nyaniko calls it, by a long shot, the most important Buddhist academic text in Thailand in the last century, and but it's also an incredibly practical guide. And Payutto is just a really brilliant monk, not just an academic but a practitioner as well, and an incredible balance of those two things. And I found reading just the introduction was a very good Buddha Nusati recollection of the Buddha. So I'll just read from that for today. Okay, so this is Payutto's introduction. People today frequently pose the question whether Buddhism is a religion, a philosophy, or simply a way of life. This query gives rise to all sorts of debates and opinions, which often just create confusion. Although this book, Buddhadhamma, is written in a form of philosophical treatise, I will not engage in the aforementioned debate. My focus will simply be on what is stated in the Buddha's teachings, on the gist of these teachings. As for the question whether Buddhism is a philosophy or not, it is up to various philosophical systems themselves to determine whether Buddhism fits their criteria. Buddhism remains what it is. It is unaffected by these judgments and interpretations. The only specification I wish to make here is that any teaching or doctrine on the truth is only intended as an intellectual exercise of logic or reason, and contains no corresponding elements for practical application in everyday life. If that's the case, it is not Buddhism, especially the original and genuine teachings given by the Buddha himself, which are referred to as Buddhadhamma. It is a difficult task to compile the Buddha's teachings, especially on the premise that one is presenting the true and genuine teachings, even if one cites passages from the Pali Canon which are considered the words of the Buddha. This is because these teachings are copious and contain various dimensions or levels of profundity, and also because imparting them accurately depends on the intelligence and sincerity of the person presenting them. It may happen that two people with divergent opinions are both able to quote passages from the sacred text, supporting their own points of view. To determine the truth is dependent on how accurately one grasps the essence of these teachings, and on how consistent the link is between one's theories and the evidence one uses to support them. In many cases, the supporting evidence is not comprehensive enough, and thus it is inevitable that the presentation of Buddhadhamma often reflects the opinions and understanding of the person interpreting it. To clarify one's analysis of the teachings, it is helpful to examine the life and conduct of the Buddha, the supreme teacher, who is the origin and source of these teachings. Although one may argue that the stories of the Buddha's activities come from the same sources as the formal teachings, nonetheless they are very useful for reflection. Occasionally, the Buddha's actions reflect his aims and wishes more clearly than the formal teachings in the scriptures. From the evidence in the scriptures and from other historical sources, one can draw a rough sketch of the events in the social environment at the time of the Buddha as follows. The Buddha was born in the Indian subcontinent about 2,600 years ago. He was born among the warrior caste, the Khattiyas, and named Prince Siddhartha. He was the son of King Suddhodana, the ruler of the Sakyan country, which lay at the northeast of the Indian subcontinent, adjoining the Himalayan mountain range. As a prince, and in accord with the wishes of the royal family, he was fully provided with worldly pleasures, which he enjoyed for 29 years, during which time he was married and had a son. At this time, absolute monarchies were in the ascendancy and were trying to expand their empires by waging war. Many other states, especially the republics, who ruled by a general assembly based on unanimous decisions, were gradually losing their power. Some of these states were conquered and incorporated into larger states, while others that remained strong were under duress, aware that war could break out at any time. and the large, powerful nations were often at war with one another. Trade and commerce were bourgeoising, giving rise to a new group of highly influential, wealthy merchants, Seti, whose prestige and authority began to extend even to the royal courts. According to the teachings of Brahmanism, people were divided into 4 social classes or castes, Varna. People's privileges and social standing, as well as their occupations, were determined by their caste. Although Hindu historians claim that the caste system at the time was not yet very strict, members of the class of manual workers were not entitled to listen to or to recite passages of the Vedas, the sacred texts of the Brahmins. These restrictions became increasingly rigid and severe. Shudras, or manual workers, who defied these injunctions and studied the Vedas were penalized with capital punishment. Moreover, outcasts, chandalas, were not entitled to any form of formal education. The sole factor for determining one's caste was birth, and the members of the Brahmin class claimed to be superior to all others. The Brahmins safeguarded and upheld the traditions of Brahmanism. They developed ever greater arcane and mysterious teachings and rituals, which became increasingly irrational. Rituals were observed not simply for religious purposes, but also as a way for powerful rulers to demonstrate their importance. And the priests who conducted these rituals gained personal advantage and riches. These ceremonies and rituals increased selfishness in those people seeking wealth and pleasure. At the same time, they caused distress for members of the downtrodden lower classes, the slaves, servants, and laborers, and they caused agony to those countless animals slaughtered as a sacrifice. During the same period, one group of Brahmins doubted whether these religious rituals actually lead to eternal life, and they began to devote themselves to the contemplation of immortality and the path to its realization. In their search for truth, many of them separated themselves from society and resorted to the forests in seclusion. Such renunciates, who renounced the household life and went forth in search of the true meaning of life, were collectively referred to as samana. The Brahmanical teachings during this time, the era of the Upanishads, was full of contradictions. Some religious factions affirmed the effectiveness of the established rituals, while other factions denounced those very same rituals. There were conflicting views on the subject of immortality and the soul, Atman. Some Brahmins claimed that the Atman is equivalent to Brahman, the Brahma, the Godhead, the divine essence. They claimed that Brahma generates and permeates all things and is ineffable, as is expressed in the phrase neti neti, not this, not that. They believed that the Atman/Brahman unity is the supreme goal of spiritual practice. They engaged in religious debates on this subject, while at the same time jealously guarding knowledge on this matter within their own circles. Meanwhile, another group of renunciates were disenchanted with the seeming meaninglessness of life and practiced in the hope of attaining exceptional states of mind or of reaching the deathless state. Some of them engaged in extreme forms of self-mortification by fasting and undertaking strange and unusual practices, which ordinary people would not believe were possible. Others developed the concentrative absorptions, the jhanas, reaching the fine material attainments, the rupa samapati, and the formless attainments, arupa samapati, while some became so proficient in the jhanas that they were able to perform marvels of psychic powers. Included among the groups of renunciates were those who wandered from village to village, establishing themselves as teachers and expounding their various religious views by engaging in religious debate and dialectic. The search for meaning and the propagation of various beliefs and teachings proceeded in an intense and energetic manner, leading to numerous ideologies and doctrines. As is mentioned in the scriptures, there were 6 major established doctrines at the time of the Buddha. To sum up, one group of people was growing in wealth and power, reveling in sensual pleasures and seeking increased riches. At the same time, many other people were neglected, and their social standing and quality of living was declining. Another group of people was separating itself from society, bent on discovering philosophical truths, but they did But they, too, did not take much interest in the conditions of society. Prince Siddhartha enjoyed worldly pleasures for 29 years. Not only did his family provide him with such pleasures, they also prevented him from seeing firsthand the lives of the ordinary folk, which were full of suffering. This suffering, however, could not be concealed from him forever. The problems and afflictions of human beings, most notably aging, sickness, and death, preoccupied the prince and caused him to seek a solution. When the prince reflected on these social problems, he saw a group of privileged people who pursued their own personal comforts, competing with one another and indulging in pleasure, without any care or concern for the suffering of others. They were enslaved by material things. In times of happiness, they were engrossed in their own selfish pursuits. In times of affliction, they were obsessed with their own distress and despair. In the end, they grew old and sick and died in vain. Another group of people, the disadvantaged, had no opportunity to prosper and were desperately abused and oppressed. They too aged, grew ill, and died in a seemingly meaningless way. Seeing his pleasures and delights as pointless, the prince became disillusioned with his own life. Although at first his search was unsuccessful, he began to look for a solution, for a way to discover lasting and meaningful happiness. His life, full of temptations and distractions, was not conducive to his reflections. In the end, he recognized that the renunciate life is uncomplicated, free from worry, and conducive to spiritual knowledge. He considered that this way of life would probably help him solve these universal human problems, and he may very well encounter renunciates who could teach him valuable lessons. This line of thinking prompted the prince to relinquish the princely life and go forth as a renunciate. He wandered around studying with various teachers, learning the methods of spiritual endeavor, known as yoga, and developing meditation until he reached the concentrative attainments, including the highest formless attainments, the arupa jhanas, and became proficient at psychic powers. Eventually, he practiced extreme austerities. In the end, he came to the conclusion that none of the methods belonging to these other renunciates were able to solve his conundrum. When he compared his present life to his earlier life in the palace, he realized that both were expressions of extremes. He decided to follow his own reflections and investigations until he finally reached complete awakening. Later, when he proclaimed to others the truth, the Dhamma, that he had discovered, he referred to it as the middle path, or the middle truth, or the middle teaching, and he referred to the system of practice that he laid down for others as the middle way, Majjhima Patipada. The Buddhist perspective is that both a life of greed and indulgence, abandoning oneself to the stream of mental defilements, and a life of complete retreat from the world, give up all involvement in and responsibility for society, and afflicting oneself with hardship are incorrect and extreme forms of practice. Neither of these can lead people to a truly meaningful way of life. After his awakening, the Buddha returned to the wider society and began to teach the Dhamma in an earnest and devoted manner for the well-being of the many folk. He devoted himself to this task for the remaining 45 years of his life. The Buddha realized that sharing the teachings and helping others would be most effective through the renunciate form. He thus encouraged many members of the upper classes to renounce their wealth, go forth into the renunciate life, and realize the Dhamma. These individuals then participated in the work of self-sacrifice, devoting themselves to benefiting others by wandering around the country and meeting with people of all social classes. The monastic community itself is an important medium for solving social problems. For example, every person, regardless of which caste or social class he or she comes from, even from the class of outcasts, has the same rights and privileges to be ordained, to train, and to reach the highest goal. Merchants and householders who are not yet prepared to fully renounce their possessions may live as male and female lay disciples, supporting a monastic sangha's activities and duties, and assisting other people by sharing their wealth. The true objective and extent of activities by the Buddha and his disciples is summed up by the Buddha's injunction, which he gave when he sent out the first generation of disciples to proclaim the teachings. Bhikkhus wander forth for the welfare and happiness of the many folk, out of compassion for the world, for the benefit, welfare, and happiness of gods and humans. The Pasadika Sutta offers a summary of how the Buddhist teachings are connected to society and how they benefit various groups of people. The holy life, brahmacharya, is only considered to have reached fulfillment, to be of benefit to the many folk, and to be firmly established, what is referred to as well declared by devas and human beings, when the following factors are complete. 1. The teacher is distinguished, experienced, mature, and advanced in seniority. 2. There are bhikkhu elder disciples with expert knowledge, who are well trained and fearless, who have realized the unsurpassed safety from bondage, who are able to teach the Dhamma to others effectively, and who successfully refute opposing doctrines correctly and in line with the Dhamma. Moreover, there are bhikkhus of middle standing and newly ordained monks who have these same abilities. 3. There are bhikkhuni disciples, nuns who are senior of middle standing and newly ordained, who have the same abilities. 4. There are male lay disciples, both those who live a celibate life and those who live at home and enjoy the pleasures of the senses, who have the same abilities. 5. There are female lay disciples, both those who live a celibate life and those who live at home and enjoy the pleasures of the senses, who have the same abilities. So even lacking female householders with such virtuous qualities means that Buddhism is not yet prospering and complete. This sutta reveals how the Buddhist teachings are intended for everyone, both renunciates and householders. Buddhism thus embraces all of society. The primary attributes of Buddhadhamma. The two main attributes of Buddhadhamma may be summarized as follows. 1. It reveals middle or objective principles of truth, and is thus referred to as the middle truth, Majjhena Dhamma, or the middle teaching. It reflects the truth in strict line with cause and effect and according to the laws of nature. It has been revealed solely for the benefit of practical application in real life. It does not promote an attempt to realize the truth by creating various theories and dogmas based on philosophical conjecture and inference, which are consequently adhered to, debated, and defended. 2. It lays down a system of practice referred to as the middle way, the Majjhima Patipada, which acts as a guideline for those undergoing spiritual training. These practitioners gain a clear insight into their lives, steer away from credulity, and aim for those fruits of practice accessible in this lifetime, namely happiness, purity, enlightenment, peace, and liberation. In practical application, the middle way is connected to other factors, such as one's life as a renunciate or life as a householder. Buddhism is a religion of action, kamawada or kiryawada, a religion of effort, viryawada. It is not a religion of supplication, nor is it a religion based on hope. The practical benefits of the teachings are available to everyone, no matter what his or her situation, beginning with the present moment. Regardless of a person's station in or condition of life, everyone can access and utilize these teachings as is suitable to his or her circumstances, both in terms of understanding the middle truth and of walking the middle way. If one is still anxious or concerned about life after this world, one is encouraged to devote oneself through proper conduct to generating the desired favorable conditions now, until one gains confidence and dispels all worries and fears about the future life. Every person is equally eligible, according to nature, to reach the fruits of spiritual practice. Although people's spiritual abilities differ, everyone should have equal opportunity to develop these wholesome results of practice according to his or her ability. Although each one of us must generate these results through individual effort, by reflecting on one's full responsibility in these matters, we are all important agents for assisting the spiritual practice of others. For this reason, the Buddha stressed the two chief principles of heedfulness, apamada, and virtuous friendship, kalyana mittata. On the one hand, one takes full responsibility for one's own life, and on the other hand, one recognizes the supreme value of wholesome external influences. The Buddha focused on several major tasks. One of these was his attempt to eliminate naive and superstitious beliefs around misguided religious ceremonies, in particular the practice of animal sacrifice, not to mention human sacrifice, by pointing out their harmful effects and overall fruitlessness. There were several reasons why the Buddha gave so much emphasis to abandoning the practice of sacrifices. First, these practices caused people to seek help from divine intervention. Second, they caused great hardship and affliction for other people and living creatures. Third, they increased selfishness and craving for material rewards. Fourth, they brought about a preoccupation with the future rather than a wish to improve the present state of affairs. To counteract these detrimental practices, the Buddha emphasized generosity and service to society. The second thing that the Buddha tried to abolish was the caste system, which used people's birth as a way to restrict their privileges and opportunities, both in society and regard to spiritual development. He established the monastic community, which welcomes people from all social classes into a system of equality, just as the ocean receives all rivers as one unified and whole body of water. This then led to the institution of monasteries, which later became vital centers of education and the spreading of culture, to the point that Hinduism followed suit and created their own monastic institutions about 1400 to 1700 years after the Buddha. According to the principles of Buddhadhamma, both women and men are equally able to realize the highest goal of Buddhism. Not long after the Buddha had established the Bhikkhu Sangha, he also established the Bhikkhuni Sangha, despite social conditions being unfavorable to a female monastic order. The Buddha was fully aware of how difficult it would be to create a suitable form for women who live the renunciate life. He exercised great care in its establishment at a time when extreme restrictions around spiritual practice were placed on women by the religions of the Vedic period, to the extent that one may say that the door had been closed to them. The Buddha taught the Dhamma using vernacular language, the language used by the common people, so that everyone, regardless of his or her station in life or level of education, would be able to benefit. This was in contrast to Brahmanism, which insisted on the sacredness of the Vedic texts and used various means to reserve higher religious knowledge within a narrow elite group. Specifically, the Brahmins used the Sanskrit language, the knowledge of which was confined to their own group, to transmit and guard the texts. Later, some individuals asked the Buddha for permission to preserve and transmit the Buddhist teachings in the Vedic language, but he rejected this proposal and had the monks continue to use the language of the common people. Furthermore, the Buddha absolutely refused to waste time debating on matters of truth through philosophical speculation, on matters which cannot be empirically proven by way of rational discussion. If people came to him with such questions, the Buddha would remain silent. He would then lead the person back to everyday practical matters. Those things to be understood by way of speech, he would share with others by speaking. Those things to be understood by way of sight, he would reveal to others to see. He would use the most direct and appropriate method according to the circumstances. The Buddha used many different methods when teaching the Dhamma so that everyone may benefit. His teachings contain many layers, those aimed for householders and members of mainstream society, and those aimed for individuals who have relinquished the household life. There are teachings focusing on material benefits and others focusing on deeper spiritual benefits. Because the Buddha taught within a Brahmanic culture and was surrounded by various religious belief systems, he was required to engage with spiritual terms used by these other traditions. As the Buddha wished for his teachings to reach the greatest number of people within a short period of time, he applied a unique approach in regard to these terms. Rather than directly refuting or discrediting people's beliefs associated with these terms, he questioned or challenged the true meanings of these terms. He did not use an aggressive approach. Instead, he promoted a natural form of transformation through understanding and spiritual development. To accomplish this, the Buddha used some of these already established spiritual terms and gave them new meanings in line with Buddhadhamma. For example, he defined the term Brahma as referring to one kind of celestial yet mortal being. In other contexts, it was used in reference to parents. He altered the concept of worshiping the 6 cardinal directions into the notion of maintaining and honoring one's social relationships. He changed the meaning of the sacred Brahmanic fire worship by the 3 kinds of sacrificial ceremonies into fulfilling a responsibility to 3 kinds of individuals in society. And he transformed the factor determining a person as a Brahmin and as noble from a person's birth into a person's conduct and spiritual development. Occasionally, the Buddha encouraged his disciples to draw upon wholesome and beneficial aspects of other religious traditions. He acknowledged and approved of any teaching that is correct and connected to virtue, considering that such righteousness and virtue is a universal aspect of nature. In the case that specific principles of practice by these other traditions had varying interpretations, the Buddha explained which ones are correct and which ones are false. He sanctioned only the practice of what is correct and wholesome. The Buddha pointed out that faulty or harmful practices observed by other religious traditions were sometimes a result of a decline or degeneracy within these traditions themselves. The original teachings espoused by these traditions were sometimes virtuous and correct. He occasionally described these original wholesome teachings. Examples of this include his historical explanations on the notions of religious austerity, tapas, and the offerings of sacrifices, the principle of leadership in regard to social assistance, and the duties of a Brahmin. In the centuries following the Buddha's death, after his teachings had spread to different areas, numerous disparities arose in people's understanding of Buddhadhamma. This occurred for various reasons. Those people who transmitted the teachings had different levels of training, understanding, and aptitude, and they interpreted the teachings in different ways. People began to mix in beliefs from other religious traditions. Local cultures exerted an influence on people's ideas and understanding, and some aspects of the teachings grew in prominence while other aspects fell into obscurity due to the interest, predisposition, and skill of those individuals who safeguarded the teachings. These disparities resulted in the breaking off into various schools, the Nikayas, as is evident today in the division between Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, along with numerous other subsidiary schools and lineages. Although the Theravada tradition is known for its precision and accuracy in preserving the original standards of the teachings, it could not escape some changes and alterations. The authenticity and validity of some teachings, even those that are contained in the scriptures, are debated among members of the current generation, who often seek proof in order to either substantiate their own opinions or repudiate the views of others. Discrepancies are especially evident in the views and practices upheld by the general public. In some cases, these views and practices seem to stand in direct opposition to the original teachings, or they have almost developed into another religious ideology, perhaps even one refuted by the original teachings. Take, for example, the understanding in Thailand of the word kamma. Most Buddhists in Thailand, when they encounter this word, think of the past, in particular of deeds from past lives. They focus on the harmful effects in the present of bad deeds from past lives and on the negative results of previous evil actions. In most cases, their understanding is shaped by a collection of such thoughts. When compared to the true definitions of kamma in the scriptures, one could see how remote some of these ideas are from genuine Buddhadhamma. In this book, the author is attempting to present Buddhadhamma in a way that is as true and accurate as possible. Because it is considered superfluous to this task, these divergent views, definitions, and practices will not be discussed. One may separate Buddhadhamma into 2 parts as matters of truth, the Saccadhamma, and matters of conduct, Caryadhamma, as theory and practice. The former is defined as those teachings pertaining to reality, to manifestation of truth, to nature, and to the laws and processes of nature. The latter is defined as those teachings pertaining to principles of practice or behavior, to benefiting in a practical way from one's knowledge of reality or one's understanding of the laws of nature. Satya-dhamma is equated with the nature and natural truths. Charya-dhamma is equated with knowing how to act in response to such truths. Within this entire teaching, no significance is given to supernatural agents, to any alleged forces over and above nature, for example, of a creator God. In order to do justice to the entire range and scope of Buddhadhamma as an integrated system, one should describe both of these aspects. That is, one should first reveal the theoretical teachings, followed by an analysis of how to apply these teachings in an effective and valuable way. For this reason, the chapters in this book, each of which deals with a specific aspect of truth, also contain guidelines on how to apply these truths in a practical way. For example, at the end of the second chapter dealing with different kinds of knowledge, there is a section on the practical meaning and benefit of such knowledge. Moreover, the main body of Buddhadhamma follows this format. The first main section pertains to specific laws of nature and is titled The Middle Teachings. The second main section pertains to a practical application of such laws in everyday life and is titled The Middle Way. Although the presentation in this book may seem unorthodox, it corresponds to an original style of teaching. It begins with those aspects of life that are problematic, and it then traces back to the source of such problems. The analysis continues to a deeper inspection of the causes of suffering, the ultimate goal of spiritual practice, and the practical methods for solving problems and for realizing the goal. Indeed, the presentation is consistent with the Four Noble Truths. That's the introduction to that book. I'll leave it there. One thing that struck me about that introduction was that where he talks about Buddhism embracing all of society, that there's no aspect of society that is not embraced by Buddhism, so that even though the Buddha himself was a renunciate, was a monk, and inspired a whole following of renunciates, the teachings were also relevant to lay people, and then ended up having a great effect on society. And in a way, actually, I've heard Lumpur Pasano speak about this, about the Buddha, that was actually really a game changer for the history of the world, that especially something like the caste system in India. When Buddhism got big, there was actually a possibility that the caste system would collapse altogether. Of course, and even now in India, they say the caste system doesn't exist, but actually it's so ingrained in society that it is still very much there. It's still very strong. So, any questions or comments?
During the Buddha's time and his influence, especially because of the caste system, and the Brahmins had a great influence over the kings, and did they try to kill or assassinate the Buddha throughout his whole life? Are there any stories?
The Buddha, the only story of somebody trying to actually kill the Buddha was of Devadatta.
Oh, his cousin, right?
His cousin,
yes.
Yeah. Later in the Buddha's life, when the Buddha was 72 years old and nearing the end of his teaching career, that Devadatta wanted to take over the Sangha, and he actually tried to kill the Buddha. But there is times when people tried to frame the Buddha and get him discredited.
Mm-hmm.
So there was and it was, a lot of it was these wanderers of other sects, not just the Brahmins, but other Samana traditions that wanted to discredit the Buddha. So like there was this, what was her name? They hired a lady to say that the Buddha got her pregnant, for example. And it was this whole plan that she would start going to the monastery and kind of infiltrate the Sangha as a lay follower, but then and then frame the Buddha. But that ended up not working out. There's all these stories of the Buddha trying to be framed and it just not working out in various ways. Or I think that was also Devadatta, was he tried to release this mad elephant to trample the Buddha. The Buddha subdued it with his metta. So there's, I think the only assassination attempts come from Devadatta, but a lot of the other ones were just discrediting attempts to, even when the Buddha was first enlightened, and within a year there was 1,250 arhants, and he's making his way to Rajagaha, which is the biggest state in India, to teach King Bibisara. And when the other religious wanderers find out the Buddha's coming, they're kind of trying, there's one sutta where they're trying to devise means to stop him from coming. And because if King Bibisara becomes one of the Buddha's students, then it's like, oh, we're finished. We're not going to get supported anymore. So they're trying to devise various means to try to keep their followers from supporting the Buddha and discrediting the Buddha. But then that actually caused them to have more faith in the Buddha. So it ended up backfiring on them. But yeah, as far as I know, the only assassination attempts were Devadatta later on. Yeah.
So Buddhism did spread quite far during his lifetime, because he probably, when he became enlightened and started his teachings, was probably like for 40 or 50 years, because he died in his 80s, I think?
It's 45 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's like he wasn't as much of a threat to the Brahmins, because it was like a smaller region, except for what you just explained with this king that might have been influenced by the Buddha.
Yeah, the Brahmins were very mixed. Some of the Brahmins really hated the Buddha, but many Brahmins, especially Brahmins who were really open and had a lot of integrity and were genuinely spiritual people, they ended up becoming the Buddha's followers and say like maybe some of their beliefs were already wholesome, and the Buddha said, yeah, you can keep doing that. And then some of them, they were able to be flexible enough. So there was really great Brahmins who ended up both ordaining under the Buddha or becoming lay followers for life. And then their teachings were then informed by the Buddha, and they were very humbled by the Buddha. There's other Brahmins who were very, very jealous of the Buddha and really also tried to find ways to discredit the Buddha. So, yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, Ajahn.
Yeah.
PhD analysis there's a PhD analysis of the most, like, of the conversion, like people who became Buddhist, and in terms of the caste, the Brahmins were the highest in the suttas. So it seems like they had the highest number of people who actually converted to Buddhism from all the castes. And then Sariputta and Mahamoggallana were both also Brahmins. So that was where the people gained the most faith. And the Buddhists seemed to also understand how to kind of change the Brahmins' minds, because they were, they're in that particular caste. So just an interesting observation.
Buddha was also learned in the Vedas, so he knew their teachings as well from when he was a prince. That was part of his schooling. So he would have been taught by Brahmins when he was young as well. You were going to say? Yeah, that's right, using the tools. Yeah, and I think in addition to that, because, just maybe 6 months, 3 to 6 months after the Buddha's awakening, there was already, he had 60 Arhat disciples already, and that's where he tells them, go off, no two in the same direction for the benefit of the many folk. And, a lot of those Arhats that went off, and we never hear about them again, they, even later on, like the Buddha's son, Rahula, when he attains arhatship, he just goes off and you never really hear about him again. There's no real stories about him. But all of those arhats would have probably had their own students and their own kind of lineages of teachings, and probably a lot of them, they would have had their own students, and because the way of the arhats, they're not going to call it Buddhism, or they're just teaching what's going to be of benefit to people. So probably a lot of people they would have known about the Buddha, but they would have just been following the teachings and practicing, and we may never even know how many people actually were practicing in India at the time. It could have spread all through India, but people were just kind of doing their own practice and keeping it quiet. So a lot of those, eventually thousands of arhats, probably had their own students as well. And a lot of people never really got to meet the Buddha, but so many people benefited and were holding virtue from that, the time of the Buddha's dispensation, but also after, in the centuries afterwards. There would have been those, for example, Rahula, we don't hear about him, but there are oral traditions about him. And it's very interesting, when I was in Bhutan, Rahula is kind of prominent. And it's, according to the oral traditions, Rahula, after he reached arhatship, he went into the Himalayas, and he was living in the Himalayas as a hermit, or as a semi-hermit, depending on alms food, but living in a very remote area. And whenever you see images of Rahula in the Bhutanese paintings, he's always depicted like holding a rat. And I have no idea why this is, but that's how you know it's Rahula. He's a monk, and he's with the Himalayas in the background, and he's kind of like got this rat on his lap. So could it be metta for animals, or maybe it's symbolic in some way? I don't know. Or maybe there's some story we don't know about yet.
A practical question, I think. I'm curious, like when recollecting the Buddha, I notice unevenness in my mind, like it tends towards like being moved or being enchanted by the the feeling of, it feels like a pleasant feeling of being like touched or something, and then the mind isn't able to settle down after that, and so it starts out feeling pleasant and then it goes into something else. And I'm curious about just evenness of mind when being moved.
Yeah, that could be a wholesome thing, a sense of joy, or being some piti sukha, being moved by the Buddha's life story. But then what do we do with that? So, yeah, or a sense of inspiration, or excitement even could come up, hearing about the Buddha, hearing about the Buddha's life, or recollecting images of the Buddha's life. Like when I would be practicing at the Bodhi tree, the Buddha's austerities would come into my mind. I would be imagining the Buddha doing his austerities in order to, really for our sake, out of compassion, for our benefit, going to that extent to try to realize the truth. And there'd be this kind of sense of excitement, but it's not very peaceful. So I think with Buddha Nusati, it's to give a sense of urgency, but then it's to kind of spur us on to do the meditation, to actually do the practice, because we've probably heard the teaching before that the hardest thing about practice is just practicing, like just getting yourself to do it. So, and I think I really appreciate Payutto makes that point in the introduction, that the interesting thing about Buddhism is that it brings us back to practicing right now. We can always bring it back to our current mental state and what we're currently doing. So yeah, the Buddha Nusati can be brightening. It can be brightening, and it can be kind of exciting, but then the whole point is to get us to practice. So, and then when we do practice, then it can calm down. We're going to consciously, it's reminding us to consciously make the mind peaceful, consciously calm the body, and consciously come back to all these different practices. He's pointing us toward the teaching. He's not pointing at himself, but then Buddha Nusati can be very, very helpful to kind of give us enough energy. If we're feeling, it has a certain function, like if we're feeling sad or despondent, or where we don't have much energy, it can be used to bring up that energy. But if that energy is already there, then probably Buddha Nusati, we might use it just at the beginning of our practice, but then there has to be a settling after that. So it's just getting us to get onto the sitting cushion, get onto the walking meditation path. Okay, that's probably good for today. We'll continue with our practice.